In the present intellectual atmosphere, any theory which seeks to give an account of the global meaning of history is frowned upon and held to be an impossible residue of our hubristic past. We must confine ourselves to undecidability, or worse still, to a narrow analytic clarity wherein the questions of history's meaning must be subtracted from the philosophical equation. For Girard, such an attitude smacks of false humility. History for Girard possesses a radical meaning, and one whose progression and culmination can be understood with a mind enlightened by Judeo-Christian revelation. This has caused more than one critic to note the similarity between Hegel and Girard due to the comprehensiveness of their visions. However, what separates Girard from Hegel is that violence is real and not just speculative, and thus the slaughter bench of history, which Hegel recognized, is not and can never be speculatively glossed over. Hence, I am arguing that the fecundity of Girard's dramatic theory of history, or what I term an apocalypse of victimhood, rests in the fact that it must be proved within our everyday lives to the point of personal sanctity, lived according to the Christian Evangel. The young Girard was deeply influenced by the French novelist and art theorist André Malraux, who wrote that history is no longer a chronology, but an anxious interrogation into the past to try and discover the destiny of the world. This is a fitting summation of Girard's task, for the world's destiny, which he discovered, must find the proof of its meaning only through the sanctity of our lives, in the face of the many violent demons haunting our world. It is with good reason that von Balthasar describes Girard's thinking as the most dramatic project today in the field of soteriology and theology generally. Girard offers a bold and daring vision of history that views Christ as the very center of history, around which humanity's desire pivots. History is inaugurated in the moment of a primeval tragedy of the founding murder, of a random scapegoat. For archaic communities to survive and thrive, they must escape the throes of acquisitive mimetic desire. Desire is never one's own, but always the desire of another. One desires an object in imitation of its desirability, modeled upon the other's desire. In this scenario, the model of desire soon becomes the obstacle of obtaining the desired object, to the point where the object disappears from view, and all that exists is unbridled rivalry in a battle of mimetic doubles. Desire's mimetic nature makes rivalry radically contagious, and it soon infects the entire community, to the point of a mimetic crisis where the community is on the brink of destruction from within. Enter the founding murder, where a surrogate victim is chosen at random and the community unleashes, unloads, and transfers its collective rage. Here the sacred and religion are birthed in the calming of violence by violence. The act of murderous scapegoating is purgative, cathartic. This gives rise to the duality of the pharmakos and the eventual divinization of the cursed victim and the curative function of poison. This is the alpha point of history, religion, ritual, and the entire cultural order. Order comes from disorder, and violence is appeased by sacrificial violence of the sacred. This violent origin is only able to become the law of history if its violence is secretively hidden from view, occult, and thus preserved. In this order, Satan casts out Satan, and in this casting out, the anthropological truth of our guilt and involvement in persecution is veiled. With the surrogate victim, guilt and the bind of mimetic contagion are externalized and loaded on marginal victims in sacrificial acts, loaded onto the ones who bear all guilt. The scapegoat mechanism is in place and is the working of a demonic apparatus that covers violence with violence. Victimhood is whitewashed, covered over at the alpha point of history, history's dramatic origin and primeval fall. But the alpha point of history's murderous beginning can only be judged from the inbreaking of its omega point. This omega point is the unfurling of a counter-history, the dramatic path of Judeo-Christian revelation, through which the apocalypse of victimhood occurs. This culminates in Christ's ultimate revelation on the cross, where the workings of the scapegoat mechanism are disarmed, unveiled, and thus the violence hidden since the foundation of the world is laid bare on the wood of the cross, in what Girard terms an anthropology of the cross. He who is put to death is wholly innocent, the scapegoat par excellence, the single holy one, in the words of Schwager. With Christ, the definitive apocalypse of victimhood occurs, and Christ takes the side of the victim, past, present, and future. In taking the side of the victim and the unveiling of the victimage mechanism, Christ calls forth a new gathering of a community of nonviolence. Christ's apocalyptic entrance into history is also the radical moment of crisis, and the apocalypse is now. After Christ, violence and mimetic rivalry are unbound because violence can no longer cast out violence. Thus, in the Girardian apocalypse, we have only the choice to convert to the non-violence of the Christian message or perish by our own violent hands. Whether these hands are atomic or ecological, it matters little, as both are forms of collective suicide. Girard's visionary theory of history is thus, like Nietzsche's, wholly Christocentric and staurological. Indeed, at stake after the rendering obsolete of the hidden workings of the scapegoat mechanism is the continuous need for conversion and reconversion of our desire to Christ's nonviolence. History's drama, at its deepest level, rides under the antithesis, Christ versus the Antichrist, a battle of true imitation and its counterfeit. What can be gleaned from the aforesaid? In our time which excuse the question of origin, Girard offers a thoroughly global vision of history's drama that is certainly open to the charge of being totalizing and monocausal. His theory, as already noted, is not unlike Hegel's in its explanatory scope and unitary daring, as a clear engine of history is set forth. Nor do we lack comparison with Heidegger's metamyth of being, wherein history is understood as being's own history. There is further room for comparison with Balthasar's Christocentric reading of history in volumes 4 and 5 of Theodrama, where history is read through the laws of intensification and polarization after Christ's appearance onto the world stage. Even if Balthasar calibrates his reading of history in an overtly speculative Trinitarian reading of the tradition. Indeed, one can even draw similarities between Bulgakov's speculatively Sophianic reading of history in The Bride of the Lamb and Christianity's dramatic confrontation with anti-Christianity. However, I contend that what saves Girard's dramatic theory of an apocalypse of victimhood from the charge of offering an overly speculative vision of history is the fact that his theory is tested in the concrete flesh and blood of desirous mimetic human relations, of love and hatred. Imitation of Christ and the message of Christianity's nonviolence must be made real in concrete praxis. In the words of Girar, the love of which John speaks manages to escape the hateful illusion of doubles. It alone can reveal the victimage processes that underlie the meanings of culture. There is no purely intellectual process that can arrive at true knowledge, because the very detachment of the person who contemplates the warring brothers from the heights of wisdom is an illusion. Any and every form of human knowledge is illusory to the extent that it has failed to submit to the decisive test, which is the test of warring brothers, as Nietzsche well knew. It may never confront that challenge and remain intact in its vanity and pride, but that will only result in sterility. Girard is no Hegelian sage, and a theory of history's drama must take into account real and not just speculative violence. In other words, any theory of history's drama must wade through the subterranean labyrinth of human desire, of ressentiment, jealousy, rivalry, envy, deceit, hatred, scapegoating, and the radical test of warring brothers and sisters. Only Christ's love can reveal the persecuting violence that lives in every human heart, and indeed our ultimate rivalry and ressentiment towards God Himself. This revelation is tested in the subterranean battleground of mimetic desire that is always externalized, made concrete in hatred or love of neighbor, friends and enemies alike. And if it is made concrete in love, this is only possible through Christ's non-violent transvaluation of human desire, offered through divine forgiveness, which alone breaks the mimetic cycle of humanity's tangled violence. After the definitive revelation of the scapegoat mechanism on the cross of Christ, how is the continuance of violence to be understood? Christ's revelation of the anthropological violence of humanity has the opposite effect of peace and has instead brought the sword. Rather than quelling violence, violence now increases. With Christ's removal of the scapegoat mechanism, violence is provoked by non-violence to come forth and show itself. And in the face of naked violence, one must convert fully to Christ's message. If not, the number of victims will increase, not decrease. Christ's message raises the stakes to dramatic crescendo, which results in an escalation to extremes. The theme of Girard's extraordinary and prophetic last work, battling to the end. But the text itself is an embattled text. Many Girardians do not know what to do with it. It can appear dark, pessimistic, conservative, and retrograde. And more than one person has said that the text belongs more to Girard's dialogue partner, Binot Chantre, than to Girard. But as Haven notes, the dark tone was Girard's, and he wanted the book to be even more apocalyptic than it was. Further, Haven confirms that all the ideas in the text are Girard's, even if the style leans more in the direction of Chantre. Girard meticulously rewrote the text and reviewed it 4 times. Girard was not one to allow such an important work as this to slip away into something that was not his own. And, as I suggested, this work must be seen as the culmination of his apocalyptic thought and inclination, the latter beginning when he was a young child. Girard's apocalyptic terminal work is dazzling, and in my reading, it is his most fascinating text. The text shows a Girard who has fully become secure in the garb of a Christian thinker in the face of his many critics. It is a text of a mature apocalypticist who is urgently worried about the fate of Europe in particular and the world in general. The text itself is somewhat loose, and the themes are diverse, yet the nucleus is clear. The text is an engagement with the classic text of Karl von Clausewitz on war, published posthumously in 1832. What intrigues Girard about the Prussian military theorist's text is its discerning of the law of escalation to extremes, and thus the possibility of total war. This was a possibility that Clausewitz glimpsed as the shrewd reader of modern warfare that he was. However, in the Napoleonic times of Clausewitz, such a possibility was not yet ripe, even if it was glimpsed upon the horizon like Yeats's Beast of the Desert in the second coming. For Girard, on the other hand, this beast is closing in upon us, which is why he seeks to raise the law of escalation to extremes, glimpsed in Clausewitz, to a general apocalyptic law of historical escalation in keeping with his mimetic reading of history already traced. This law of escalation rides, for Girard, under the banner of the Pascalian trope that violence is at war with truth. Pascal says in his 12th provincial letter, "It is a strange and tedious war when violence attempts to vanquish truth. All efforts of violence cannot weaken truth and only serve to give it fresh vigor. All the lights of truth cannot arrest violence and only serve to exasperate it. History itself is the rising dramatic intensification between the peace of truth and the lie that violence is. The themes of the text range from confrontations between Clausewitz and Hegel, Clausewitz and Napoleon, to Hölderlin's sorrow, to post-Napoleonic relations between France and Germany, concluding with the theme of the Pope and Emperor, to name just some of the most notable. In 2012, at a conference on the theme of catastrophe and conversion, Girard boldly, and I think rightly, asserted that politics can no longer save us, echoing while inverting Heidegger's famous Der Spiegel proclamation, "Only a God can save us." This sentiment is earlier expressed in Battling to the End. Again, once the hidden scapegoat mechanism of violence is uncovered by Christ's radically exceptional, non-violent love, the possibility of pseudo-peace is likewise destroyed. Violence can no longer cast out violence. Satan can no longer cast out Satan. Girard says, when sacrifice disappears, all that remains is mimetic rivalry, and it escalates to extremes. The inbreaking of the incarnation of Christianity into the world is thus the apocalypse. This apocalypse is the turning point of history. After the apocalypse of Christ, the radical choice between the peace of nonviolence and the utter violence of unbridled mimetic rivalry is thrust upon us and made absolute. Today we are witnessing the dissolution of the cataconic historical empires that hold back the chaos through their violent pacifications and impositions. Whether in the ancient figuration of empire as seen in the Pax Romana in both its Roman and Catholic guises, to the totalitarian empire of the Pax Sovietica, or its capitalistic double of the Pax Americana. Today, empire is fully universalized, and this empire is the empire of the ubiquity of violence. If Girard's eschatological worldview is correct, and the current course of history seems to be proving him so, what does he suggest we do? Again, what is a visionary theory of history worth that cannot tell us what to do in the present? The answer is nothing. Girard's is not such a theory, but to many it may sound far from adequate, naive, quietistic, even downright foolish. On more than one occasion, Girard was asked the question on what we are to do in the face of his apocalyptic proclamations. His answer was always the same: to work on one's own personal sanctity, to pray, to convert, and to ceaselessly reconvert and conform our lives to Christ through imitation of Christ. And the latter conviction is perhaps most beautifully expressed in the 5th chapter of Battling to the End, entitled Hölderlin's Sorrow. This sentiment or conviction of Girard concerning the radical need for personal sanctity unites his work with so many of his compatriots, that is, those great figures of the Catholic literary revival, such as Léon Blois, Paul Claudel, Charles Péguy, and Georges Bernanos, but also to figures such as Henri Bergson, Simone Weil, and Emmanuel Levinas. And even of greater importance, this conviction concerning sanctity unites Girard to the deepest meaning of Christianity in all its various traditions and instantiations. The call to holiness is universal. Girard saw modernity as a kind of cult and even a mythology which worships human reason as a god, just as the ancients worshipped gods. Girard's answer to our eschatological and apocalyptic times was summed up by the words of Michel Siri at his speech for the induction of Girard into the Académie Française. Siri says, "Sanctity is a supernatural genealogy of truth that modernity never suspects. We speak the truth only in loving innocently. We discover, we produce nothing except through becoming holy." I am not a Girardian. Girard is not omniscient. He can be wrong, and he was wrong about many things, many of which he admitted to. Perhaps even his grand theory of the scapegoat mechanism is false. And if it is not false, it certainly is not and cannot be the full story about Christianity and humanity as a whole. But it is a very brilliant and compelling anthropological account. But even more important is that so much of the truth of what he says can be verified within our own convoluted hearts and within the very annals of history itself, including the violent history we are today making. If the ultimate verification of truth in a Christian sense is to know a thing by its fruits, then Girard's thought is true because it calls us to conversion to Christ. He is not the only one that can teach us these things, but his theory gives an apocalyptic urgency to the call to sanctity in a time where total war is very much on the table, on the horizon. I conclude with a few words from Battling to the End, where he says, "Salvation lies in imitating Christ." This results in setting off a fiery chain of positive mimesis, which ends in love. Girard says concerning this love, "Up to a certain point, we might be in a state of positive undifferentiation. In other words, identified with others. This is Christian love, and it exists in our world. It is even very active. It saves many people, works in hospitals, and even operates in some forms of research. Without this love, the world would have exploded long ago. It is more than ever up to each one of us to hold back the worst. This is what being in eschatological times means. Our world is both the worst it has ever been and the best. It is said that more victims are killed, but we also have to admit that more are saved than ever before. Everything is increasing." The message of Girard's dramatic and apocalyptic reading of history is as clear as it is simple. In this time of history's radical intensification, we must battle to love to the very end.